He used my money, my brain, and my time, and when the business took off, he cut me out like I was never there. Sometimes I wonder if he truly believes it, or if the lie just became more valuable than our history. It happened at an airport newsstand in Chicago, Terminal 3, between a rack of candy bars and travel pillows. His face stared back at me from the cover of Entrepreneur magazine, standing alone in front of the company we had built together. The headline read, "Self-Made Success, How Daniel Reed Built CloudSync from Nothing." 5 years of my life, thousands of sleepless nights, every dollar I had saved, all of it erased in a single headline. Before we get into the part that still hurts to tell, let us know where you're watching from, and hit subscribe so you don't miss more deep, raw stories like this. I wasn't angry at first, that came later. In that moment, I felt something more primal, the disorienting vertigo of watching someone rewrite my history while I was still living it. My hands shook so badly that the magazine rattled like autumn leaves. We had met at a tech conference in Seattle 6 years earlier. I was presenting research on distributed systems architecture, my specialty after 8 years at Microsoft. Daniel was there representing a small consulting firm. He approached me after my presentation with that peculiar intensity that I would later recognize as his defining quality. Not passion exactly, but a kind of relentless ambition that viewed the world and people as resources to be utilized. In tech, especially as one of the few women in my position, genuine recognition of technical achievement was rare. Men either oversimplified when speaking to me or tried to poke holes to establish dominance. Daniel did neither. He spoke to me as an equal, and in those early days, that felt revolutionary. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into a weekend whiteboarding session. By the end of the month, we were sketching out the architecture for what would eventually become CloudSync, a distributed cloud storage system with unprecedented reliability and security features. The idea consumed us. I had a stable job, stock options, a clear path to senior architecture at Microsoft. Daniel was a freelancer with boundless confidence. I looked at our diagrams, our code snippets, and saw something truly innovative, something I had helped create. I cashed out my 401k, sold my condo, moved into a cheap apartment, and we incorporated 2 weeks later. Reed and Chen Solutions officially existed, with Daniel as CEO and me as CTO. Equal partners on paper, 50-50 ownership. I handled the technology, he handled the business side. A perfect partnership, or so I thought. The first 2 years were brutal and beautiful. We worked out of my apartment, then a tiny office above a Thai restaurant. I coded until my vision blurred, rebuilt our architecture from scratch 3 times, interviewed every engineer we hired. Daniel secured our first round of funding, brought in initial clients, handled the emerging legal complexities. We celebrated our wins together, our first major client, our first million in revenue. We weathered the failures together too, the server crash that lost 3 days of client data, the key engineer who left for Google, the investor who pulled out at the last minute. During those hard times, Daniel would assure me we were building something that mattered. He claimed we were in it together all the way. I believed him completely, foolishly. By year 3, CloudSync was gaining serious traction. Our proprietary architecture was outperforming larger competitors. We moved into real offices, hired a proper team, secured serious venture funding. The company name changed from Reed and Chen Solutions to simply CloudSync, cleaner for branding, Daniel explained, and I didn't fight it. I was focused on building the product, not on what we called it. That's when the subtle shifts began, so gradual that I didn't recognize the pattern until it was too late. It started with press. Daniel began doing interviews about the company, logical since he was the CEO, but in these early pieces, the language was always we and our team. He credited me specifically for the technical architecture. He talked about our partnership. I was busy building the product and managing our engineering team, so I was actually relieved he handled the press. Then came the Series B funding round, $15 million, a number that seemed inconceivable just months earlier. The press release went out. CloudSync, founded by CEO Daniel Reed, secures $15 million in funding. My name was mentioned in paragraph 4, alongside our new VP of marketing, not as co-founder, just as CTO. I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't in this for the glory. I was building something revolutionary. The attribution was secondary. Still, something tightened in my chest when I read that press release. A small warning knot that I chose to ignore. The pattern continued. At conferences, Daniel would be introduced as the founder rather than co-founder. In meetings with major clients, he would present our growth strategy while I presented the technical architecture, but somehow my portion became positioned as supporting his vision rather than as the foundation of the entire enterprise. My name began disappearing from company materials, first from the website homepage, then from investor decks, finally from the Our Story page entirely. It was death by 1,000 cuts, my erasure happening so gradually that challenging any single instance would have seemed petty. And always, when I did raise concerns privately, Daniel had a ready explanation. Marketing simplified it for the press release, you know how they are. The website redesign is focusing on client solutions, not team bios. Investors respond better to a clear chain of command. We can clarify the full founding story after the round closes. Each explanation seemed reasonable in isolation. Each came with reassurance about my value and importance, and each subtly reinforced a new narrative, that my contributions were technical, not visionary, that I was essential but not foundational, that CloudSync was Daniel's brainchild which I had helped execute. I was too busy to fight these small battles. Our user base was doubling quarterly. I was filing patents, refining our architecture, making critical decisions daily. The work consumed me. I was building something that tens of thousands of people relied on. Did it really matter whose name was on the press releases? Then came Tanya Rodriguez, a new engineer we hired from Google. 6 months into her tenure, as we were working late solving a persistent latency issue, she casually mentioned what had brought her to CloudSync. I saw Daniel's keynote at Cloud Summit last year and was blown away by his vision. Then I researched the company more and found your architecture white paper. That's what really convinced me to join, seeing the technical innovation behind his concept. His concept, my fingers froze over my keyboard. Yeah, the whole distributed redundancy model with the nested encryption layers. The stuff he talked about founding the company to build. The blood drained from my face. That architecture wasn't his concept, it was mine. The foundation of CloudSync came from my research, my expertise, the innovations I had been working on long before I met Daniel. I pulled up the video of that keynote speech later that night. There was Daniel, confident and charismatic on stage, describing the technical foundations of CloudSync as if they had sprung fully formed from his mind. He used terms and concepts I had taught him. He presented slides I had created with my name removed. He told the origin story of CloudSync with himself as the sole protagonist, the visionary who saw what cloud storage could be and made it reality. Not once in the 45-minute presentation did he mention my name. I watched that video 3 times in a row, a cold, clarifying fury building with each viewing. This wasn't a marketing simplification or an accidental oversight. This was systematic erasure, deliberate theft of not just credit, but identity, my identity as creator, innovator, founder. The next morning I confronted him in his office. His initial surprise gave way to defensive rationalization. He insisted he was simplifying for public consumption, that it was better for the company to have a clear, singular founder narrative for media purposes. He reminded me that we both owned the same amount of equity, so what did the public-facing story matter? When none of those arguments moved me, he shifted tactics. He claimed that while I had indeed contributed the initial technical concepts, he had been the one to see their commercial potential. That without his business acumen and vision, my ideas would have remained academic theories rather than a successful company. There was just enough truth in his words to make them devastating. He had seen the commercial potential. He had shaped product direction. He had built the business side almost single-handedly while I built the technology. But these contributions made him a co-founder, not the founder, a partner, not a sole creator. When I pointed this out, his expression changed. The mask of reasonable explanation slipped just for a moment, and I saw something cold and calculating beneath. Then he smiled, reached for his phone, and showed me our latest valuation report, $220 million pre-IPO. We're almost there, Alex, everything we've worked for. If we start having public disagreements about founder attribution now, it puts all of that at risk. The board, the investors, the IPO prep team, they need stability, not co-founder drama. Let's stay focused on the goal. After we go public, after we've secured everything we've built, we can clarify the founding story however you want. It was manipulative, it was calculated, and in my core I knew it was a lie that after would never come. But the valuation number glowed on his screen, representing everything we had built, everything I had sacrificed for. I told myself I could address the attribution issue later, that the company's success was the priority now. For 6 more months, I swallowed my objections and poured myself into preparing for the IPO. I worked harder than ever, determined that the product at least would reflect my vision and standards. I told myself that the work was what mattered, not the credit. Then came that day in the airport, that magazine, that headline. I bought the magazine and found a quiet corner to read the article. 6 glossy pages of Daniel's journey as a solo founder who had conceived of CloudSync's revolutionary architecture and single-handedly disrupted the cloud storage industry. Photos of him in our office with our team. a full-page portrait of him standing confidently in front of the CloudSync logo. And a single sentence acknowledging me buried deep in the article. Reed recruited Alex Chen, a talented engineer from Microsoft, as his technical lead early in the company's development. Technical lead, not co-founder, not CTO, not even the person who had created the company's technological foundation, just a talented recruit and employee. I never boarded my flight. Instead, I went home, powered up my laptop, and began meticulously documenting everything. Emails from our earliest days discussing my architectural concepts, original whiteboard photos, early code repositories with my commits, patent applications with my name, the original incorporation papers showing both of us as founders. As I compiled this evidence, I made a discovery that turned my cold fury into something approaching calm clarity. In preparing for the IPO, Daniel had been quietly revising company history and official documents. New investor decks referred to him as founder and CEO. The draft IPO filing prepared by our lawyers listed him as the sole founder. Most damning of all, I found a revised operating agreement that had never been presented to me for signature, which referred to him as founding CEO and me merely as CTO. The magazine article wasn't a misunderstanding or a journalist's error. It was the culmination of a deliberate, systematic campaign to rewrite our company's origin, to erase me from my own creation, to steal not just my credit, but my legacy. That night, as I stared at my computer screen surrounded by evidence of my own erasure, I finally saw the full pattern. How Daniel had been gradually, strategically removing me from the CloudSync origin story. How my focus on the work itself had made me vulnerable to this theft. How my discomfort with self-promotion had been weaponized against me. I closed my laptop at 3 a.m., my mind eerily calm despite the revelation. I had trusted Daniel completely. I had believed in our partnership. Now I saw that while I had been building our company, he had been steadily excising me from its story. I knew then that I had a choice to make. I could continue in silent complicity, preserving the company's value and stability at the cost of my own legacy. Or I could fight to reclaim my place in the history of what we had built together, even if that meant jeopardizing everything. As dawn broke over the city, I made my decision. This was no longer about credit or recognition. This was about truth, about refusing to be erased, about standing up and saying I was here, I built this, I matter. The battle for my legacy had begun. The thing about betrayal is how it rewires your memory. Suddenly, moments you dismissed as insignificant become damning evidence. Incidents you rationalized reveal themselves as calculated steps in a larger plan. The past reshapes itself into a road map of warning signs that you were too blind, too trusting, too focused on the work itself to recognize. In the weeks after discovering the magazine article, I became an archaeologist of my own erasure, digging through years of company history to uncover the systematic way Daniel had been removing me from our story. The pattern, once revealed, was painfully obvious. There was the company website redesign in year 3. Our About Us page had originally featured both our photos and bios, clearly marking us as co-founders. The redesign reduced my presence to a listing among the executive team, while Daniel's smiling face dominated the homepage beside the tagline, "One Man's Vision, a Revolution in Cloud Storage." When I'd questioned this at the time, the marketing team explained it was about creating a clear brand identity. People connect with individuals more than teams, they said. It's a standard approach. Daniel had backed them up, showing me examples of other tech companies using the same strategy. I'd relented, focusing on the upcoming product release instead of corporate branding. What I hadn't realized was that the marketing team was simply executing Daniel's directive. Then there were the speaking engagements. Early on, we'd done panels together, Daniel discussing business strategy while I explained the technology. But around year 4, the pattern shifted. Daniel began accepting solo keynote spots at major industry events. When I asked about joining, there was always a reason why it wouldn't work. They only offered one speaker slot. It's focused on business strategy, not technical details. Your time is more valuable focused on the product right now. I'd even been grateful at times, relieved to avoid public speaking, which had always made me uncomfortable. I hadn't seen it as the deliberate sidelining it was. Most telling were the early press interviews we'd done together. I found them in the digital archives, pieces from tech blogs and industry publications, where we were clearly positioned as co-founders with complementary expertise. These had been systematically replaced on our company's press page with newer interviews featuring only Daniel. The narrative had been literally rewritten, with the evidence buried where no one would think to look. The most painful discoveries were the subtle ways Daniel had claimed credit for my technical innovations. In a keynote speech from year 4, he described how he had solved our original partition tolerance problem, a solution that had come from my research before we even met. In an industry magazine feature, he discussed his realization about nested encryption that had led to CloudSync's superior security model, a direct reference to a paper I had published at Microsoft. These weren't vague claims about company direction or vision. These were specific appropriations of my technical contributions, my ideas, my innovations, my expertise, repackaged as his own strokes of genius. I compiled everything methodically, created a timeline of our company history alongside the evolving narrative Daniel had constructed. The evidence was overwhelming, not just of credit theft, but of a deliberate, sustained campaign to rewrite history. It wasn't just about ego or attribution. It was about the fundamental truth of what we had built and how it came to be, about refusing to be erased from my own life's work. Armed with this evidence, I scheduled another meeting with Daniel. This time, I came prepared not just with emotional appeals, but with documented proof of my systematic removal from company history. The meeting took place in his corner office, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Seattle skyline. The contrast wasn't lost on me, his expansive vista compared to my windowless interior office filled with servers and technical equipment. Even our physical spaces in the company had come to reflect the narrative he was building. I laid out my evidence methodically, showing him the progression of his erasure campaign. The website changes, the altered press narratives, the technical appropriation, the IPO documents listing him as sole founder. As I spoke, I watched his expression shift from surprise to calculation to what appeared to be genuine confusion. "This is how business works, Alex," he said when I finished. "Companies need clear, simple narratives. Consumers, investors, they respond to stories they can understand. One visionary founder is a story everyone gets. Two co-founders with different domains of expertise. That's complicated. It dampens enthusiasm, reduces clarity." "It's not about simplifying," I countered. "It's about honesty, about acknowledging that CloudSync exists because of both of us. That its foundational technology, the very thing that makes it valuable, came from my research, my expertise." "No one's denying your contributions," he said, leaning back in his ergonomic chair. "You're well compensated, your name is on the patents, your technical authority within the company is absolute, but externally we need a clear leadership story." "A clear leadership story doesn't require erasing me from our founding," I said. "It doesn't require claiming my technical innovations as your own." His face hardened then, the familiar mask of reasonable explanation slipping. "Do you think investors care who came up with the nested encryption protocol? Do you think customers make purchasing decisions based on who solved the partition tolerance problem? These are technical details, Alex. What matters is the overall vision, the business model, the growth strategy, my domains." "Your domain's built on my innovation," I said. "Without the technology, there is no business. Without my work, there is no CloudSync. And without my business acumen, your technology would be gathering dust in some academic journal," he shot back. "Ideas are worthless without execution. I built this company while you built the product. There's a difference." There it was, the fundamental disconnect in how we viewed our partnership. To Daniel, I was essentially a highly skilled employee who had contributed the technical foundation, but not the company itself. In his mind, the business was the company, and the technology was merely a component of it. The realization left me cold. This wasn't a misunderstanding we could resolve. It was a fundamental difference in how we valued each other's contributions. In Daniel's worldview, the business builder inherently deserved more credit than the technical innovator. The person who raised money and closed deals was more foundational than the person who created the underlying technology. "We're 3 months from IPO," he continued, his voice softening. "The company is valued at nearly $250 million. Your equity stake is worth over $100 million. Is public attribution really worth jeopardizing that? Worth creating instability right when we're at the finish line?" It was the same tactic he'd used before, leveraging the financial outcome to silence my concerns. But this time I saw it for what it was, manipulation, a way to make my legitimate grievance seem petty and self-sabotaging. "This isn't about money," I said. "It's about the truth, about my legacy, about not letting you steal credit for innovations that came from my mind, my research, my expertise." "Steal is a strong word," he said, his tone warning. "It's the accurate word," I replied. "You're systematically removing me from our company's history and claiming my technical innovations as your own. That's theft, Daniel, intellectual and historical theft." His expression darkened. "Be careful, Alex. Accusations like that can have serious consequences." Are you threatening me? I'm advising you as a friend, as a partner, to think very carefully about your next steps. We've built something extraordinary together. Don't let pride or attribution issues destroy it. I'm not the one destroying anything, I said. I'm trying to preserve the truth of what we built and how we built it. He sighed, glancing at his watch. I have an investor call in 5 minutes. Let's table this discussion. Give us both time to cool down and think rationally about the best path forward. Remember what's at stake here, not just for us, but for our employees, our investors, everyone who believes in CloudSync. It was a classic Daniel move, appearing reasonable while subtly suggesting that my concerns were emotional rather than legitimate, making me seem like the unreasonable party for insisting on the truth. I left his office that day with a clarity I hadn't possessed before. This wasn't a misunderstanding between partners. It wasn't a marketing simplification that had gone too far. It was a deliberate campaign to rewrite history, to claim sole credit for a company we had built together, and Daniel had no intention of stopping. In the days that followed, I began to notice other things, small interactions that took on new meaning in light of what I now understood. How Daniel would subtly correct people who referred to me as co-founder in meetings. "Alex is our brilliant CTO," he would say, the phrasing precise and deliberate. How he would introduce me to new investors as one of our earliest team members rather than his founding partner. How certain key meetings about company strategy or fundraising would be scheduled when I was deep in technical problem solving and unlikely to attend. What struck me most was how the rest of the company had absorbed this narrative. Newer employees referred to Daniel as the founder without hesitation. Marketing materials told the story of his singular vision. Even longtime team members who had been there from the beginning had begun to adopt his version of events, referring to choices Daniel made early on that had actually been joint decisions or even my initiatives. It was as if an alternate history had been created around me while I was too focused on building the product to notice. A history in which Daniel was the visionary founder and I was simply the talented technical hire who had executed his ideas. I sought out Tanya Rodriguez, the engineer whose casual comment about Daniel's concept had first opened my eyes. Over lunch, I carefully asked about her understanding of the company's founding. "From what I've gathered," she said, "Daniel had the core vision for distributed cloud storage with the multi-layered security approach and then brought you on to architect the solution. Is that not right?" The casual way she repeated this entirely fictional version of events made my stomach clench. Actually, the multi-layered security approach was based on research I published before I even met Daniel, I said. We founded the company together as equal partners. The core architecture was my innovation. The business model was his. Tanya looked genuinely surprised. That's not the impression I got from, well, everything. The website, the press stuff, the all-hands meetings. Daniel is always positioned as the founder. Founder singular, not co-founders. She nodded slowly, realization dawning. Now that you mention it, yes, always singular. And what about technical innovations? The nested encryption model, the redundancy system. Those are usually presented as part of his original vision that the technical team executed, she said, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Alex, I'm sorry, I had no idea." That conversation confirmed what I already suspected. The narrative distortion wasn't limited to external marketing. It had permeated the company itself, reshaping how our own employees understood CloudSync's origins and evolution. I spent the next week gathering more evidence, carefully speaking with other early employees under the guise of documenting our journey for the IPO process. Their accounts were revealing. Several remembered clearly that we had co-founded the company, but had noticed the gradual shift in narrative over time. Others who had joined slightly later had always understood Daniel to be the founder and me the first technical hire. None had questioned these inconsistencies. Why would they? Company history wasn't their concern. After gathering all this evidence, I scheduled a meeting with our COO, Marlene Chen, no relation, who had joined in year 3 and had become someone I trusted. She had always treated me with respect and seemed to understand my value to the company, even as Daniel's revisionist narrative took hold. I laid out everything I had discovered, the pattern of erasure, the appropriation of technical credit, the systematic rewriting of company history. Marlene listened carefully, her expression giving away nothing. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. "I suspected something like this was happening," she finally said. "The inconsistencies in how the founding story was presented. They didn't add up, but I assumed it was a mutual decision, a marketing strategy you had both agreed to." "It wasn't," I said flatly. She nodded. I can see that now. The question is, what do you want to do about it? It was the first time anyone had asked me that directly, and I realized I hadn't fully formed an answer. I want the truth acknowledged, I said. I want recognition as co-founder. I want credit for my technical innovations. I want to stop this revisionist history before it becomes permanent. Those are reasonable requests, Marlene said, but you should understand the potential consequences of pushing this issue right now. We're 3 months from IPO. Any suggestion of co-founder conflict could spook investors, delay the filing, potentially reduce the offering price significantly. So I'm supposed to accept being erased from my own company's history because it's financially convenient. I'm not saying what's right or wrong, she replied carefully. I'm laying out the reality. You have every right to demand proper attribution, and that demand carries potential consequences for the company valuation. Both things can be true simultaneously. That night I consulted a lawyer, not our company counsel, who ultimately reported to Daniel, but an independent attorney specializing in corporate and intellectual property law. I shared the full story, along with the documentation I had gathered of my role as co-founder and technical innovator. The lawyer reviewed everything carefully, then delivered her assessment. You have a strong case for recognition as co-founder. The incorporation documents, the early press, the technical patents, they all support your claim. But pursuing this aggressively right before an IPO would be procedurally complex and potentially damaging to the company's valuation. So once again, I'm supposed to accept being erased because it's inconvenient to correct the record. Not necessarily, she said. There are multiple potential approaches here. You could demand immediate, full correction of the historical record and accept the IPO consequences. You could negotiate a partial correction now with a commitment to fuller acknowledgement post-IPO. Or you could secure binding commitments for post-IPO recognition while allowing the current narrative to stand through the public offering. And if Daniel refuses any of these options, then you have choices to make, she said simply. Choices with significant consequences for you, for him, and for the company you built together. I made my decision that night. I would fight for recognition, not after the IPO, not in some watered-down compromise, but now, fully, unequivocally. I would demand acknowledgement as co-founder and proper credit for my technical innovations, and I would be prepared to accept whatever consequences that fight entailed. The next morning I requested another meeting with Daniel. When his assistant asked about the topic, I said simply, the founding story of CloudSync. His response came within minutes, meeting accepted, scheduled for the following day. The battle lines were drawn. I spent that night preparing not just my evidence, but my resolve. Whatever happened next would determine not just my relationship with Daniel, but the historical record of what I had helped create. I would not let my legacy be stolen without a fight. The morning of my confrontation with Daniel, I arrived early at the office. The sprawling floor plan was nearly empty as I walked past the reception area with its massive CloudSync logo, my design, though few remembered that now. The wall displayed framed press clippings chronicling our rise. Daniel's face smiled from most of them. Mine appeared in precisely two, both from our earliest days. I settled in my office, reviewing my evidence one final time. Incorporation documents showing both our names as founders, early press referring to us as co-founders, and documentation of my architectural innovations predating Daniel's involvement. I had organized everything chronologically, creating a clear timeline of both the truth and the distortion that had replaced it. At 9:00 a.m., I walked into Daniel's office, only to have our confrontation cut short by a conveniently timed board meeting. It was classic Daniel, avoiding difficult conversations through strategic interruptions that dissipated confrontational energy. The board meeting was excruciating. 8 men and 1 woman focused on the upcoming IPO while Daniel led discussions, referring repeatedly to my company and my vision. I sat silently, absorbing each verbal erasure. When technical architecture was discussed, he gestured toward me, but positioned my work as implementation of his vision rather than foundational innovation. After the 2-hour ordeal, Daniel was immediately surrounded by board members. He caught my eye across the room and mouthed later before turning away. My concerns would continue to be deferred, treated as a minor irritation rather than a fundamental issue of truth. I drafted an email to Daniel, copying Marlene, our COO, formally requesting corrections. Acknowledgement as co-founder in all materials, accurate attribution of the technical architecture, and a corrective statement to the press regarding CloudSync's founding. Daniel's reply came quickly, suggesting we discuss potential adjustments to the narrative, not corrections, but adjustments. He scheduled a meeting for the following day, ending with a subtle warning about the potential negative impact on the company if I raised these concerns to the board before our IPO. When I arrived at the conference room the next afternoon, I found not just Daniel and Marlene, but also Sophie Winters, our chief counsel. Her presence immediately changed the dynamic to something more legally significant with greater potential ramifications. I presented my case methodically, showing the documentation of our equal partnership and the gradual erasure of my co-founding role. Daniel responded by framing the revisionist history as necessary marketing simplification, a standard business practice for creating cleaner narratives for investors. He argued that complex founding stories with multiple domains of expertise didn't resonate with public markets. When I pushed back, his facade cracked momentarily. He dismissed the importance of technical details in the company narrative, positioning my innovations as merely supportive of his overarching vision. In his worldview, the person who raised money and closed deals inherently deserved more credit than the person who created the underlying technology. Sophie provided convenient institutional support, nodding there was no regulatory requirement to identify all initial participants as founders in public materials or SEC filings. The legal designation of founder was somewhat fluid. I saw the trap closing. They were willing to make cosmetic changes to the website, easily reversed after the IPO, while maintaining the distorted narrative in the legal documents that would define the company's public existence. When I insisted the IPO filing needed to clearly state that CloudSync was co-founded by both of us, Daniel's tone hardened. He framed my request as potentially delaying our IPO, risking our market window, creating investor uncertainty, possibly reducing our offering price, all for what he characterized as a footnote in company history. The meeting ended in deadlock, with Daniel citing an investor call and suggesting we table this discussion until we'd all had time to consider potential compromises. Another deferral, another delay. My lawyer's assessment was blunt. Daniel and the board were stonewalling, hoping I'd accept minor concessions rather than risk disrupting the IPO. If I accepted, the official record would continue to reflect Daniel as the founder and driving force behind CloudSync. That narrative, once established in public markets, would be extremely difficult to correct later. This was the critical moment when CloudSync's official history would be written. If I didn't fight now, the revisionist version would become accepted truth, not just externally but within the company itself. After a night weighing options, I drafted a formal letter to the board of directors, methodically presenting the facts of CloudSync's founding, my role as co-founder, and my technical contributions. I attached comprehensive documentation, incorporation papers, early press, patent filings, emails, photos, everything establishing the truth of our partnership. My letter concluded by stating I had attempted to resolve this directly with Daniel without success, and was therefore bringing it to the board's attention given its implications for our IPO filing. I wasn't seeking to disrupt our public offering. I simply wanted the historical record to accurately reflect how CloudSync came to be. The board chairman called within an hour, scheduling an emergency call to discuss my letter. His tone suggested he viewed this primarily as a problem to be managed, rather than a wrong to be righted. The call was brutal. Daniel presented me as a valuable technical contributor with recently developed outsized expectations about my historical role. He acknowledged I had been involved from the early days, but characterized my claims as revisionist, driven by ego and IPO anticipation. I countered with documentation that clearly established our co-founding relationship. The board members listened silently, occasionally asking questions but giving little indication of their leanings. As the call progressed, I realized my fundamental disadvantage. These were Daniel's relationships cultivated over years. They knew him, trusted him, had invested in his vision. I was the technical person who rarely attended their meetings, who spoke of architecture and protocols rather than market opportunity and growth metrics. Even with irrefutable documentation, I was fighting against established relationships and a narrative they had already internalized and repeated to their own partners and investors. The call ended without resolution, with the chairman promising to discuss the matter further and seek a solution that protects the company's interests while addressing Alex's concerns. Diplomatic speak for buying time and finding the path of least disruption. That afternoon, Marcus Zhang, our lead investor known for bluntness, visited my office unannounced. His message was direct. Co-founder disputes were poison for IPOs. Investors wanted clarity and stability, not debates about who did what 5 years ago. When I insisted this wasn't a subjective dispute, but documented fact versus convenient fiction, Marcus asked what my ideal outcome was. When I stated I wanted recognition as co-founder and proper attribution for my technical innovations, he asked pointedly whether meeting those demands was worth potentially delaying or damaging the IPO. His words carried the weight of my choice: fight for historical truth at the potential cost of the company's smooth transition to public markets, or accept erasure for the sake of that transition. The board is meeting tomorrow to discuss this, Marcus said before leaving. I suspect they'll seek a compromise position that addresses some concerns while maintaining narrative stability. Consider carefully what you can live with versus what you're willing to sacrifice everything for. After he left, the full weight of my situation settled over me. This wasn't just about truth versus fiction. It was about power, relationships, competing interests. It was about a system designed to prioritize smooth transactions over historical accuracy, financial outcomes over foundational truths. The unfairness burned in my chest. I had poured my expertise, my innovation, my life into building CloudSync, had created the very technology that made it valuable, and now I was being asked to accept erasure from its history for the sake of a clean narrative and a successful IPO. I contacted my lawyer to prepare for whatever came next. This was no longer just a dispute over attribution. It was a battle for my legacy, my life's work, my place in the history of what I had helped create. And I was not going to surrender it without a fight. The board's compromise solution arrived via email the next morning. A carefully worded message from William Chen, framed as a reasonable middle ground that would address everyone's concerns. They proposed adding a section to the company website acknowledging me as technical co-founder, updating my bio to detail my early contributions, and including a brief mention in the IPO filing that CloudSync had been founded by Daniel Reed with Alex Chen as founding CTO and technical architect. Not co-founder, founding CTO. The distinction was small but significant. It positioned me as an early, important employee rather than an equal partner in creation. The email concluded with a gentle but unmistakable warning. The board expressed their belief that this approach best served the company's interests at this critical juncture, and trusted all parties would recognize the importance of presenting a unified front approaching their public market debut. I read it 3 times, watching how the careful language obscured the fundamental injustice. They were offering a cosmetic adjustment while maintaining the false core narrative. Daniel would remain the founder in the official history, while I would be relegated to a technical supporting role. The rage that swept through me was unlike anything I had experienced before. Not the hot, immediate anger of an insult or injury, but something colder and more absolute, the fury of witnessing deliberate injustice and realizing you are powerless to prevent it, at least through conventional channels. I declined their offer in a single-line email, stating that the proposed solution perpetuated a false narrative about CloudSync's founding that I could not accept. What followed was a week unlike any in my professional life. A cascade of meetings, calls, and private conversations, all designed to pressure me into accepting the board's compromise. Board members called to express concerns about the impact of a founder dispute on our IPO prospects. Daniel's supporters within the company, primarily on the business side, began treating me differently, with a mixture of wariness and pity. Even old allies seemed uncomfortable around me, caught between their knowledge of the truth and the institutional pressure to maintain the approved narrative. Through it all, I continued performing my technical duties. The product still needed leadership, the engineering team still needed direction, and whatever happened with the founding narrative, I was determined that the technology itself, my technology, would be flawless when we went public. But the emotional toll was immense. I stopped sleeping properly, waking at 3 a.m. with my mind racing through arguments, evidence, potential strategies. I lost my appetite, subsisting on coffee and occasional protein bars. I developed a persistent tension headache that no amount of ibuprofen could touch. What haunted me most during those sleepless nights was the gradual realization that this wasn't just about Daniel's ambition or the board's expediency. It was about something more fundamental, the devaluation of technical contribution compared to business leadership. The assumption that the person who raised the money and closed the deals inherently deserved more credit than the person who created the technology itself. I saw it in how people discussed the situation, the subtle implication that my desire for proper credit was somehow petty or ego-driven, while Daniel's actual theft of credit was just savvy business positioning. The suggestion that I should be satisfied with my equity stake and technical authority, as if historical accuracy were a luxury rather than a fundamental right. There was a gendered component too, though few would acknowledge it directly. As a woman in tech, I had always faced subtle resistance to my authority, always had to prove my expertise more thoroughly than male counterparts. Now I was experiencing the ultimate form of that dynamic, having my foundational contribution minimized and attributed to a more suitable, male figure who better fit the archetype of the visionary founder. The subtle messaging was clear. Businessmen founded companies, technical women supported them. Never mind the reality of who had created the intellectual property that made the company valuable in the first place. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part. While I had allies who privately acknowledged the truth, Marlene Jerome, a handful of early engineers who remembered our actual founding story, no one was willing to publicly challenge the institutional narrative. The pressure to maintain the smooth path to IPO was too great, the potential cost of resistance too high. Daniel, meanwhile, had shifted to a strategy of concerned magnanimity in company settings. He spoke about me with apparent respect, referring to my invaluable technical leadership and critical role in CloudSync's development. But he never acknowledged me as co-founder, never corrected those who referred to him as the founder, never conceded the core issue at stake. In private, when forced to interact directly, his tone was different, a mixture of impatience and calculation, as if I were a problem to be managed rather than a partner deserving of basic respect and truthful recognition. 2 weeks after rejecting the board's compromise, I received an unexpected message from Catherine Voss, a prominent tech journalist known for her insightful coverage of Silicon Valley culture. She was working on a feature about CloudSync's upcoming IPO and wanted to interview me about the technical innovation behind the company's success. I agreed, more out of a desperate need to speak with someone outside our closed corporate ecosystem than any strategic consideration. We met at a coffee shop several blocks from the office, away from the watchful eyes of CloudSync employees. Catherine was sharp, observant, and surprisingly direct. After a few preliminary questions about the technology itself, she shifted focus to the inconsistency in CloudSync's founding narrative. She noted that early press materials clearly positioned Daniel and me as co-founders, while recent coverage presented him as founder and me as early technical hire, asking me to comment on that shift. The question hung between us. This was it, the moment to either maintain the official fiction or speak the truth publicly. The potential consequences of either choice flashed through my mind: continued erasure or potential company crisis, silence or disruption, acceptance or conflict. I finally stated that CloudSync was founded by both of us, that we were equal partners with complementary expertise, and that the current narrative positioning Daniel as sole founder was historically inaccurate. Catherine appeared surprised by my direct contradiction of the company's public position, nodding it was a significant discrepancy from the official story. I explained that the official story was wrong and that I had extensive documentation proving we were co-founders, and that the core technological innovations came from my research and expertise before the company even existed. When she cautioned that this could impact the IPO, I responded that historical accuracy shouldn't be sacrificed for market convenience. At her request, I shared select documents, incorporation papers showing both our names as founders, early press releases identifying us as co-founders, emails discussing my architectural innovations. Nothing confidential or proprietary, just evidence of the basic truth of our founding relationship. Driving home afterward, I felt a mixture of terror and relief. I had finally spoken the truth publicly to a journalist with significant reach. Whatever happened next was out of my hands. The thought was both frightening and strangely freeing. I didn't have to wait long for consequences. The next morning, my phone exploded with messages as Catherine's article went live. CloudSync IPO clouded by founder dispute. Technical co-founder challenges official narrative. The piece was meticulous, balanced, and devastating to the clean narrative CloudSync had been cultivating. It laid out the documentary evidence of our co-founding relationship, the gradual erasure of my role, and the current dispute over proper historical recognition. It included quotes from early employees confirming that Daniel and I had been understood as equal partners in the company's creation. I had barely finished reading when the board chairman called, his voice tight with controlled fury, demanding I come to his office within the hour and bring my lawyer. The next few hours were a blur of accusations and emergency meetings. Daniel and the board were incandescent, positioning my interview as deliberate sabotage of the IPO process. I was accused of violating confidentiality, acting against the company's interests, and putting personal grievance above collective success. My lawyer calmly pointed out that I had shared only factual, historical information about the company's founding that was neither confidential nor proprietary. She noted that I hadn't sought out the journalist but merely answered questions truthfully when approached, suggesting that if speaking the truth about CloudSync's origins damaged its IPO prospects, perhaps the problem lay with the false narrative being presented to investors. Her logical, measured defense did little to calm the emotional temperature in the room. Daniel paced like a caged animal, occasionally stopping to fix me with a look of pure betrayal, as if I were the one who had stolen something from him, rather than the reverse. During a momentary break in the procedural discussions, Daniel angrily questioned whether I understood what I had done, suggesting I had jeopardized years of work because I couldn't accept a standard corporate narrative. When I pushed back that he had systematically erased me from our company's history, claiming credit for my technical innovations, he insisted he had built the company by raising money, closing clients, and navigating the competitive landscape, turning my technical ideas into a viable business. I maintained that none of that gave him the right to erase me from our founding or claim my innovations as his own, reminding him that we were equal partners with different expertise, regardless of how inconvenient that truth might be for his preferred narrative. The board eventually separated us for cooling off while they assessed the situation. Left alone, I found dozens of messages from current and former colleagues, industry contacts, even old classmates who had seen Catherine's article. Most notable were messages from several female technical founders expressing solidarity and sharing their own experiences with credit appropriation and historical erasure. When Marlene returned, she informed me that the board had called an emergency session to discuss damage control options, potentially including leadership restructuring. The implication was clear: they were considering removing or sidelining me to stabilize the IPO process. That night, alone in my darkened office, I confronted the full psychological impact of what had happened. There's a unique pain in being removed from your own story, in watching someone else claim credit for your ideas, your work, your creation. It's about the fundamental human need to have your reality acknowledged and your contributions valued. I finally allowed myself to feel the emotional impact of Daniel's betrayal, crying for the first time since this crisis began. When the tears subsided, something else took their place, a clear, cold determination to challenge the system that enabled this kind of historical revision. I opened my laptop and began to write my story, the true story of CloudSync's creation, my technical innovations, and the gradual erasure campaign. Writing it felt like reclaiming something essential, authorship of my own story and my role in creating something meaningful. At midnight, my phone rang with the board's decision. Whatever happened next, I would fight for the truth, not just for me, but for everyone who would come after me, facing the same systems and power structures that enabled this kind of historical revision. Because some things are worth fighting for, no matter the personal cost. The board's decision arrived with devastating clarity the morning after Catherine's article broke. Sitting in William Chen's office across from him and 3 other board members, I listened as William informed me they needed me to take a leave of absence. When I flatly repeated his words, questioning if this was their response to my telling the truth about our company's founding, William maintained a carefully neutral expression. He explained it was for creating instability at a critical juncture, assuring me the leave would be paid and temporary, just until after the IPO was complete. I clarified their expectations with growing disbelief. They wanted me to disappear while they proceeded with a false founding narrative, allowing Daniel to continue presenting himself as CloudSync's sole creator and taking credit for my technical innovations. Marcus Zhang, the blunt investor who had visited my office days earlier, leaned forward and explained that I needed to understand the reality of the situation. The IPO underwriters were concerned, key institutional investors had questions, and the narrative inconsistency had created uncertainty, threatening their entire public offering. I pointed out that the inconsistency existed because the official narrative was false, suggesting a simple solution: correct the record, acknowledge me as co-founder, and properly attribute the technical innovations. The board members exchanged glances, the particular look of people believing they're dealing with someone unreasonable, someone who doesn't understand how the world really works. Marcus explained that the IPO filing had already been submitted to the SEC and substantial revisions would delay their offering indefinitely. The market window they'd targeted could close, and the valuation they'd worked toward could be significantly reduced. When I asked if the truth was less important than the timeline, William sighed and invoked the board's fiduciary responsibility to all shareholders, including me, to maximize the company's value. He characterized my situation as merely a dispute about historical credit, the resolution of which wasn't worth breaching their responsibility. His words landed like a physical blow. They had reduced the systematic erasure of my founding role, the theft of my legacy, my life's work, to a dispute about historical credit, as if I were arguing over who should be thanked first in an awards speech, rather than fighting against being removed from my own company's origin story. I refused to take a leave, reiterating that I co-founded this company and created the technology that makes it valuable. I had done nothing wrong except insist on the truth being acknowledged. Janet Freeman spoke with a gentler tone but delivered the same message. The public disagreement was damaging CloudSync at the worst possible moment, and they needed to stabilize the situation quickly. When I questioned if their solution to someone pointing out they've been erased from company history was to erase them from company history and sideline them during the public debut, William insisted it was temporary. After the IPO, when the company was stable in public markets, they could revisit the founding narrative and update the company history to more fully reflect my contributions. I almost laughed at this familiar promise, the same later that Daniel had been offering for years, the perpetually receding horizon where proper credit would finally be given. A later that never actually arrived. I simply stated my disbelief and refusal to voluntarily step aside while a false narrative about our company's founding became permanently enshrined in public markets. Marcus's expression hardened as he revealed the board had voted unanimously. If I wouldn't take a voluntary leave, they would suspend me pending an investigation into potential violations of my fiduciary duties and company confidentiality policies. The threat was now explicit: comply or be forced out, accept erasure, or face manufactured accusations of wrongdoing. When I demanded to know what fiduciary duty I had violated by stating documented facts about our company's founding, William smoothly replied that I had created instability threatening the company's valuation immediately before our IPO and shared internal company information with a journalist without authorization. I countered that historical facts about who founded the company weren't internal company information, and if those facts threatened the IPO, perhaps the problem lay with the false narrative they were presenting to investors. Our conversation continued in circles, but the outcome was predetermined. They had made their decision before I even entered the room. The meeting was merely theater. In the end, I was given an ultimatum: take a voluntary leave with full pay until after the IPO, or be suspended pending investigation with potential termination to follow. I requested time to consult with my lawyer, and William agreed, setting a deadline of end of day. I left the meeting in a fugue state, walking through the CloudSync offices I had helped build from nothing. Engineers nodded as I passed, some looking away awkwardly. News traveled fast, and everyone knew about Catherine's article and the ensuing chaos. I wondered how many knew I was about to be pushed out of the company I had co-founded, and how many would care, having absorbed the official narrative positioning Daniel as the true creator and me as merely a technical contributor. Office, I called my lawyer. Her assessment was blunt. They were using their leveraged position to force me out during the IPO. The investigation threat was likely a bluff. They would struggle to prove any actual violation, but fighting it would be messy, public, and potentially damaging to my reputation. When I bitterly observed that they were winning, with Daniel stealing credit while I was pushed aside for pointing it out, she acknowledged their significant short-term leverage, but emphasized this wasn't over. We could consider other approaches, especially after the IPO when immediate pressure decreased. We discussed options, legal challenges, public statements, potential settlements, but all felt inadequate against the institutional forces aligned against me. The board, investors, and IPO process itself were all structured to prioritize smooth transactions over historical accuracy, convenient narratives over documented truth. After ending the call, I sat contemplating the impossible choice: accept temporary removal and tacitly endorse the false founding narrative, or fight and potentially face a manufactured investigation designed to justify permanent termination. Neither option addressed the fundamental injustice of Daniel systematically erasing me from our company's history and claiming my technical innovations as his own. As I stared at the office I had helped build, something shifted inside me. A lifetime of accommodating, focusing on work rather than credit, trusting in fairness and merit, all crystallized into sudden, absolute clarity, a breaking point, a moment of transformation. I opened my laptop and began typing an email to Daniel, copying the entire board. I stated that I would not take a leave of absence or be erased from the company I co-founded or denied credit for the technical innovations that made CloudSync valuable. The board had made its position clear. The convenient fiction of Daniel's sole foundership was more important than the documented truth of our partnership, and the smooth timeline of the IPO mattered more than historical accuracy or basic fairness. I rejected this false choice between my legacy and the company's success, asserting that both could and should coexist, rooted in truth rather than expedient fiction. I was taking another path entirely. Effective immediately, I was resigning as CTO of CloudSync. My resignation wasn't accepting erasure, but refusing to participate in it. I would not lend my continued presence and technical leadership to a company that denied my founding role and misattributed my innovations. I had fulfilled all contractual obligations and ensured an orderly transition, but would not continue building value for an enterprise that had systematically removed me from its history. I read the email twice, feeling a strange calm settle over me. This wasn't impulsive rage or wounded pride speaking, but a clear-eyed assessment of reality and a deliberate choice to value truth over position, principle over expediency. I hit send. Then I began packing my personal items, mementos from 5 years building CloudSync from concept to valuable enterprise. I worked methodically, feeling oddly detached from the magnitude of what I had just done. I had walked away from the company I had co-founded from 5 years of building from a pre-IPO equity stake worth millions, but I had reclaimed something more valuable: my agency, my integrity, my refusal to be erased from my own creation story. Standing on the sidewalk outside the CloudSync building, my few possessions in a cardboard box, I felt the weight of betrayal and injustice lifting slightly with each step. I hadn't received the recognition I deserved or won the battle for proper credit, but I had refused to participate in my own erasure. I had chosen truth over position, principle over profit, integrity over expediency. In that choice, that moment of absolute clarity when I decided I would not be removed from my own story, regardless of the cost, I had found something unexpected: freedom. The liberation of refusing to accept erasure, of reclaiming authorship of my own narrative, of choosing truth over convenient fiction. I hailed a cab and gave the driver my home address. As we pulled away from the CloudSync building, I didn't look back. That chapter was closing, but the larger story, the true story of who had built CloudSync and how, was just beginning to be properly told. And I would be the one to tell it, no matter the cost, because some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the personal sacrifice involved. And the truth of what you've created, of your rightful place in that creation's history, that's among the most important of all. Time reveals truth in ways that arguments and evidence sometimes cannot. 3 years have passed since that confrontation in the cafe, 3 years of growth, transformation, and unexpected outcomes for all involved. The joint statement Daniel and I eventually released acknowledged our complementary co-founding roles in CloudSync's creation. The carefully negotiated language spoke of his business vision and my technical innovation coming together to create something neither could have built alone. It wasn't the full-throated acknowledgement of equal partnership I had originally sought, but it was a significant correction to the revisionist history that had completely erased my founding role. The IPO proceeded 2 months later than originally planned. The offering price was slightly lower than initial projections. The controversy had taken its toll, but still represented a substantial valuation for a company of CloudSync's size and stage. My equity stake, which I had been willing to walk away from entirely for the sake of historical truth, ended up being worth $87 million at the opening bell. Financial security is a strange thing. It doesn't heal wounds or correct injustices, but it does provide a foundation from which to rebuild. I used part of that windfall to create something new, not another tech company, at least not immediately, but a foundation focused on recognizing and supporting technical innovators from underrepresented groups, people whose contributions might otherwise be minimized, misattributed, or erased from the historical record. We called it Attribution Matters, a name that captured both our mission and my personal journey. The foundation funded meticulous historical research documenting the often overlooked contributions of women and minorities to technological innovations. It created scholarships for technical founders who didn't fit the standard founder archetype perpetuated by tech media and venture capital. It supported legal resources for those facing credit appropriation or historical erasure in their own work. It wasn't just therapy for my own wounds, though there was certainly an element of that. It was an attempt to address the systemic issue I had personally experienced, the industry's tendency to reshape founding narratives to fit expected patterns, typically centered around charismatic male business figures rather than technical innovators, especially when those innovators didn't match the conventional founder image. The foundation's work touched a nerve in the tech community, revealing how common my experience had been. We heard from countless technologists, particularly women and people of color, who had watched their innovations attributed to others, their founding roles minimized or erased, their contributions relegated to footnotes in their own creation stories. Some had fought these revisionist narratives, as I had, often at significant professional and personal cost. Others had accepted erasure, believing they had no choice if they wanted to maintain their positions or protect their companies. But all expressed the same core pain, the unique anguish of being removed from your own story, of watching someone else claim credit for your ideas, your work, your creation. As for CloudSync itself, the company prospered in public markets despite the pre-IPO controversy. The product continued to gain market share, the technology, my technology, proving its value and resilience in increasingly competitive market conditions. Daniel remained as CEO, the public face of the company, though our joint statement had at least partially corrected the historical record regarding its founding. We maintained a professional distance. Daniel and I, the wounds were too deep, the betrayal too fundamental for genuine reconciliation. But we had found a way forward that allowed both of us to maintain our dignity and the company to succeed. A cold peace perhaps, but peace nonetheless. The most unexpected long-term consequence came from the tech industry itself. Our public dispute had sparked broader conversations about founding narratives, proper attribution, and the industry's tendency to mythologize certain types of founders while minimizing or erasing others. Journalists began asking more pointed questions about company origins, digging beneath official narratives to document the actual contributions of various team members. Venture capitalists, sensitized to the potential reputation damage of funding revisionist histories, began conducting more thorough due diligence regarding founding teams and their respective contributions. Companies themselves, seeing the potential costs of disputed narratives, became more careful about accurately representing their origin stories. None of this represented a wholesale transformation of tech industry culture. The preference for simple, marketable founding narratives centered around charismatic business figures remained strong. The tendency to undervalue technical contributions, especially from those who didn't fit the standard founder mold, persisted in subtle and not-so-subtle ways. But there was movement, a growing recognition that founding stories should reflect historical reality rather than marketing convenience. An increased awareness of the personal and ethical costs of historical erasure and credit misattribution. A slightly higher bar for truth in how companies presented their origins and the contributions of their founding teams. For me personally, the long-term consequences were complex and multifaceted. There was vindication in having the historical record partially corrected, in seeing my role as co-founder acknowledged rather than erased. There was financial security from the IPO proceeds, providing freedom to build something new on my own terms. There was professional satisfaction in seeing the foundation's work begin to address the systemic issues that had impacted my own journey. But there were scars too, relationships damaged or destroyed in the confrontation, a lingering wariness about partnerships and collaboration, a hypersensitivity to credit and attribution that sometimes made it difficult to work with others, always anticipating potential erasure around every corner. Most significantly, there was the complex relationship with CloudSync itself. The company I had helped create, had poured my expertise and innovation into, had been willing to walk away from entirely for the sake of historical truth. I remained its largest individual shareholder outside of Daniel and the venture investors. I used its services for my foundation's operations. I still felt pride when it succeeded and concern when it faced challenges. But I was no longer part of it, no longer building it, shaping it, contributing to its evolution. The technology still bore my architectural fingerprints, but it was being extended and refined by others now, gradually evolving away from my original vision. There's a particular grief in that separation, in watching something you created continue without you. Not quite like losing a child, but perhaps like seeing a child raised by someone else, developing in ways you might not have chosen. A mixture of pride in what you helped create and sadness at no longer being part of its ongoing story. 18 months after the IPO, I began building again. Not another cloud storage platform, but something adjacent, a company focused on secure, privacy-preserving data analytics. Using some of the core architectural concepts I had developed for CloudSync, but applying them to an entirely different problem domain. I called it Verity, a name that captured both the technical focus on data veracity and the personal commitment to truth that had defined my journey. This time I was the sole founder. The vision, the technology, the direction were all mine, with no ambiguity about whose ideas and work were creating it. Building Verity was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating to have complete control, to know that my contributions couldn't be minimized or misattributed, to build exactly the company and culture I envisioned without compromise or negotiation. Terrifying to have no partner to share the burden, no complementary expertise to fill the gaps in my own knowledge, no one else to blame if things went wrong. The experience of building alone after years of partnership was a powerful lesson in both my strengths and limitations. I was brilliant at technological innovation, at seeing architectural possibilities others missed, at designing elegant solutions to complex technical problems. I was less natural at business development, at marketing, at the human connections that turned technological innovation into commercial success. These were the areas where Daniel had excelled, the complementary skills that had made our partnership so effective in CloudSync's early days, before ego and ambition corrupted it. Building alone meant either developing those skills myself or hearing others to provide them, neither option as seamless as a true founding partnership at its best. But the trade-off was worth it. The clarity of sole creation, the unambiguous attribution, the freedom from wondering when or how my contribution might be minimized or erased, these compensated for the additional challenges of building alone. 3 years after my confrontation with Daniel, I received an unexpected invitation to speak at a major tech conference, not about Verity or my current work, but specifically about my experience with CloudSync in the aftermath. About choosing principle over position, truth over convenience, integrity over expediency. About refusing to be erased from my own creation story, regardless of the professional and financial consequences. My first instinct was to decline. I had moved on, was building something new, didn't want to be defined by that conflict forever. But the conference organizer persisted, noting how many founders, particularly women and others from underrepresented groups, had cited my stand as inspirational in their own journeys. How my public refusal to accept erasure had given others courage to demand proper credit for their contributions, to resist historical revision of their roles. The day of the talk, I stood backstage, fighting a familiar anxiety. Public speaking had never been my strength, another area where Daniel had excelled while I preferred to focus on the technology itself. But this wasn't about technical architecture or product features. This was about my personal journey, my choice to walk away from a $100 million equity stake rather than accept erasure from CloudSync's history. Looking out at the sea of faces, many of them young women in technical roles, people who didn't fit the standard founder archetype, I felt a sudden clarity about why this story mattered beyond my personal vindication. It wasn't just about me or CloudSync or Daniel. It was about the broader pattern of who gets credited for innovation, whose contributions get highlighted or erased, whose names remain attached to the things they create. I set aside my prepared remarks and spoke directly from that realization. I explained to the audience that attribution matters not just for individual ego or recognition, but for who gets funded next time, which contributions are valued and rewarded, who young innovators see as role models, and ensuring that the true diversity of technological creation is visible rather than hidden. I emphasized that most fundamentally, it matters for simple human dignity, the basic right to be acknowledged for what you've built and contributed to the world, to not have your lived experience denied and replaced with a more convenient narrative. The response was overwhelming, not just the immediate standing ovation, but the dozens of people who approached afterward to share their own experiences of credit appropriation and historical erasure. Technical co-founders whose contributions had been minimized or attributed to business partners. Innovators whose breakthroughs had been claimed by supervisors or colleagues. Creators whose work had been absorbed into simplified company narratives that erased their individual contributions. In their stories, I heard echoes of my own journey, the gradual realization of systematic erasure, the impossible choice between accepting historical revision or fighting at significant personal cost, the complex aftermath of that choice, whatever direction it went. But I also heard something new, how my public stand had affected others in similar situations, how my refusal to accept erasure had given others courage to demand proper credit for their contributions, how the visibility of my fight had made it slightly harder for others to be written out of their own creation stories. That was perhaps the most meaningful long-term consequence of all, not the partial correction of CloudSync's historical record, not the financial security of the IPO proceeds, not even the creation of the foundation or Verity, but the small role my stand had played in encouraging others to resist erasure, to demand proper attribution, to insist that the historical record reflect reality rather than convenience. As I left the conference that evening, walking through a light Seattle rain to my car, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Not because the wounds had fully healed or the injustice had been completely corrected, neither was true, but because I could finally see the full arc of my journey with CloudSync, from creation to betrayal to stand to aftermath. I could understand it not just as a personal injury, but as part of a larger pattern affecting countless innovators whose contributions didn't fit neatly into the tech industry's preferred narratives. And in that understanding, that recognition of my experience as both uniquely mine and part of a broader systemic issue, I found a kind of peace. not the peace of perfect justice or complete healing, but the quieter satisfaction of knowing that my stand had mattered. That refusing to accept erasure from my own creation story had not only partially corrected the historical record regarding CloudSync, but had made it incrementally harder for others to be removed from theirs. 3 years after walking away from CloudSync rather than accept removal from its history, I had found not just a new direction but a clearer purpose. Not just to build new things, but to help ensure that those who build are properly credited for their creations. Not just to tell my own story truthfully, but to create conditions where others wouldn't have their stories rewritten without consent. The scars remained, the complexity of my relationship with CloudSync, pride in what I had helped create mixed with the lingering pain of how I had been pushed out of its story, would never fully resolve. But these wounds had also transformed into something productive, fueling the foundation's work and informing how I built Verity's culture of meticulous attribution and historical accuracy. I hadn't won completely. The partial acknowledgement of my co-founding role fell short of the full historical truth. I hadn't lost completely. My stand had forced a correction to the most egregious erasure and secured my place in CloudSync's official origin story. Like most real-world conflicts, the outcome existed in shades of gray rather than absolute victory or defeat. But I had refused to accept erasure, had declined to be removed from my own creation story, regardless of the professional or financial consequences, had chosen truth over convenient fiction, integrity over expediency. And in that choice, in that moment of absolute clarity when I decided I would not be written out of CloudSync's history, whatever the cost, I had found not just my voice but my purpose. The long-term consequences of my stand against erasure were still unfolding, would continue to evolve in ways I couldn't predict or control. But this much was clear. Refusing to accept removal from my own story had not only partially restored my place in CloudSync's history, but had helped create space for others to similarly insist on proper attribution for their contributions. And that ripple effect beyond my personal vindication was perhaps the most meaningful consequence of all. 5 years have passed since I first saw that magazine cover erasing me from CloudSync's founding story. 5 years of struggle, transformation, and unexpected growth. 5 years of building something new while still fighting for the truth of what came before. I turned 43 last month, celebrated quietly with the Verity team and a few close friends. Nothing elaborate, just good food and better conversation in the rooftop garden of our modest Seattle office. There was a moment as the evening sun cast long shadows across the cityscape, when I caught sight of the CloudSync building in the distance, its distinctive blue-green glass facade unmistakable against the skyline. 5 years ago, that sight would have triggered a complex mixture of pride, pain, and rage. Today, I felt something different, a quiet acknowledgement. That building housed something I had helped create, something that continued to evolve beyond me but still bore the architectural fingerprints of my innovation. Something I was no longer part of building but would always be part of founding, regardless of the revisionist history that had initially tried to erase me. The current state of things is both simpler and more complex than I could have imagined when I walked away from CloudSync rather than accept removal from its history. The company itself continues to thrive. The core architecture I designed has proven remarkably durable, adapting to evolving security challenges and scaling requirements. Daniel remains CEO, the public face of the company, though our joint statement acknowledging my co-founding role remains on the website, a small but significant correction to the historical record. My equity stake, the $100 million I had been willing to sacrifice entirely for the sake of historical truth, has more than doubled in value as CloudSync continued its growth trajectory. I've gradually reduced my position over time, using the proceeds to fund the Attribution Matters Foundation and my new company, Verity. I maintain enough shares to be among the largest individual investors, a connection to my creation that I've chosen to preserve despite everything that happened. Daniel and I maintain a careful distance. We've seen each other at industry events, exchanged brief civil greetings, acknowledged each other's presence without engaging deeply. The wounds are too fundamental for genuine reconciliation, the betrayal too absolute for authentic forgiveness. But we found a way to coexist in the relatively small world of Seattle tech, to acknowledge our shared history without relitigating its most painful chapters. Verity has grown steadily, now employing 67 people and serving clients across healthcare, finance, and government sectors. We'll never reach CloudSync's scale or valuation. Our focus on privacy-preserving data analytics is inherently more specialized, our growth more measured and deliberate. But we've built something valuable, something meaningful, something that reflects my vision and values without compromise. More importantly, we've built it with a fundamental commitment to proper attribution and historical accuracy. Every team member is credited for their innovations. Every contribution is acknowledged rather than absorbed into a simplified founder narrative. The origin story of how Verity came to be and who built it is meticulously documented, preventing the kind of historical revision that erased me from CloudSync's early narrative. The Attribution Matters Foundation has grown beyond my initial vision, becoming a significant force in documenting and addressing systematic credit misattribution in technological innovation. We've published research mapping patterns of erasure across the tech industry, particularly affecting women and other underrepresented groups. We've created resources for founders to protect their rightful attribution through explicit agreements and documentation. We've funded legal support for those facing credit appropriation or historical erasure in their own work. Most meaningfully, we've collected hundreds of stories from those who have experienced similar erasure, technical co-founders whose contributions were minimized or attributed to business partners, innovators whose breakthroughs were claimed by supervisors or colleagues, creators whose work was absorbed into simplified company narratives that removed their individual contributions. These stories have been both validating and heartbreaking. Validating to know that my experience wasn't unique, that the pattern of erasure I experienced reflected systemic issues rather than just personal conflict with Daniel. Heartbreaking to see how widespread this phenomenon is, how many brilliant creators, particularly those who don't fit the standard founder archetype, have watched their innovations attributed to others, their founding roles minimized or erased, their contributions relegated to footnotes in their own creation stories. But there's also been progress. The conversation about proper attribution has expanded significantly since my public stand 5 years ago. Investors now routinely perform more thorough due diligence regarding founding teams and their respective contributions. Journalists ask more pointed questions about company origins, digging beneath official narratives to document the actual roles of various team members. Companies themselves, seeing the reputational and potentially legal risks of disputed narratives, have become more careful about accurately representing their founding stories. For me personally, there has been healing, not complete or perfect, but meaningful nonetheless. The rage that once consumed me when thinking about Daniel's betrayal has gradually transformed into something cooler and more detached. I no longer feel the burning need to correct every mention of CloudSync's founding that fails to acknowledge my role. I no longer obsessively track every interview or article where Daniel discusses the company's origins. The truth matters deeply to me still. The historical record should reflect reality rather than convenience. Proper attribution remains worth fighting for, but my personal vindication is no longer the driving force it once was. What matters more now is addressing the systemic issues that enable this kind of erasure, creating conditions where future innovators, especially those from underrepresented groups, receive proper credit for their contributions. Last month brought an unexpected development, one that crystallized how much has changed and how much remains the same. A major business magazine was preparing a 10-year retrospective on cloud computing innovations, with CloudSync prominently featured. The journalist reached out to me directly, asking for my perspective as co-founder and technical architect of the platform. The acknowledgement was gratifying, evidence that at least some of the historical record had been corrected, but more striking was my own response to the request. 5 years ago, I would have seized this opportunity to definitively establish my role, to ensure my contributions were properly credited, to prevent further erasure of my founding position. Instead, I found myself focusing less on my personal attribution and more on the broader technological journey, on the evolution of distributed storage architectures, on how our early innovations had influenced industry standards, on what current developments suggested about future directions. I still corrected a few misconceptions about CloudSync's origins when they arose in the interview, but it wasn't my primary focus or emotional driver. The resulting article acknowledged me clearly as co-founder and technical architect, credited my innovations appropriately, and presented CloudSync's creation as a partnership of complementary expertise rather than a solo founder narrative. Daniel was quoted as well, carefully acknowledging our joint founding vision, while highlighting his own contributions to the business model and growth strategy. It wasn't perfect, subtle wording choices still positioned him as the primary founder and me as the technical complement, but it was substantially more accurate than the complete erasure that had triggered my original stand. Progress, if incomplete, movement in the direction of truth, if not its full realization. Daniel sent me a brief message after the article was published, the first direct communication between us in nearly 3 years. He commented that it was a good piece and accurately reflected our complementary contributions. There was no apology for the systematic erasure that had preceded it, no acknowledgement of the battle required to achieve even this partial correction of the historical record. Just a tacit recognition that this more balanced narrative was acceptable to him now, years after he had fought so hard to prevent it. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that wouldn't either reopen old wounds or offer a forgiveness I didn't genuinely feel. Some betrayals are too fundamental for true reconciliation. Some breaches of trust cannot be repaired, only acknowledged and moved beyond. Our story together had reached its conclusion. What remained was ensuring its accurate documentation in the historical record. I think often of a message I received from a young female engineer shortly after my public stand against erasure from CloudSync's history. She expressed how watching me refuse to be written out of my own creation story gave her courage to insist on proper credit for her contributions. She noted that knowing someone was willing to walk away from a $100 million equity stake rather than accept erasure made her much smaller stand seem possible. That ripple effect, that incremental shift in what others believe possible, may ultimately matter more than the specific outcome of my own battle for recognition. The partial correction of CloudSync's historical record was significant, but the broader impact on how the tech industry thinks about proper attribution and founding narratives could prove more lasting and meaningful. I still have the magazine that started it all, that glossy cover showing Daniel alone in front of the CloudSync logo, the headline proclaiming his self-made success in building the company from nothing. I keep it in my office drawer, not as a reminder of betrayal, but as evidence of how thoroughly history can be revised when convenience and marketability override truth. Of how easily someone can be removed from their own creation story when institutional forces align to prioritize a simpler, more appealing narrative over complex reality. 5 years after first seeing that magazine cover erasing me from CloudSync's founding story, I found not just a new direction but a clearer purpose. Not just to build innovative technology, but to ensure that those who build are properly credited for their creations. Not just to tell my own story truthfully, but to create conditions where others won't have their stories rewritten without consent. This is not a story with a perfect ending. The historical record remains partially revised, my co-founding role acknowledged but still subtly minimized in many tellings. Daniel continues as CloudSync's CEO, still positioned as its primary creator in public perception. The systems and power structures that enabled my initial erasure persist, though perhaps with slightly higher standards for truth and attribution than before. But it is a story with a truthful ending, one that acknowledges both the injustice of attempted erasure and the complex, partial nature of its correction. One that recognizes that standing for truth matters even when the victory is incomplete. One that understands that refusing to be removed from your own story has value beyond personal vindication, rippling outward to affect how others perceive what's possible in their own battles for proper attribution. I don't know what the next 5 years will bring, but I do know this: I will continue building, creating, innovating, and ensuring that creation is properly attributed, not just for myself, but for everyone involved. Because some stories are worth fighting to preserve, some truths worth defending regardless of the cost. And the accurate history of who creates the technology that shapes our world, that's among the most important stories of all.